Hello, it is another Tuesday, and that means it's time for another in real life video. For this week, we are taking a general viewer submitted question. If you would like, as per usual, in the comments below, you can submit your own, or you can also have a request for a ranking, and it helps a lot in both circumstances if you include a question mark, because it helps me sort through everything and find it a lot easier to add it to our ever-growing, of course ever-shrinking list. This week's comes in from a gentle viewer whose username should be somewhere in the lower third of your screen right about now. And they write in saying, here is a thought-provoking question. Could procedural generation work in a modern Elder Scrolls game? A decently thought-provoking question, I guess. Of course, with their inclusion here of modern, I think they're definitely alluding to the fact that in the past there were Elder Scrolls games that made heavy use of procedural generation, that being the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall, where loads of the landscape was procedurally generated, which is why, part and parcel, why that game is so enormous and has sort of this famous or infamous reputation for having such an enormous scale to it, where there's so much landmass that I don't know, it starts to become banal to explore. Like, it becomes a little bit boring to get through a lot of it because there is so much and it is so procedurally generated. You start to notice similarities. There's less and less interesting stuff cropping up. There's other games as well that pull off proc gen, procedural generation. If you're unfamiliar with this, I'll occasionally be calling it proc gen here. There are a lot of games that use it to good effect. Maybe the best in my memory right now, and it keeps getting better because they keep updating it and tacking onto its procedural generation system, that being No Man's Sky. That entire game, as far as I remember, is procedurally generated, wherein you go to a place and there's certain parameters set up by the game itself, I guess you would say, and you go in and you find like, oh, this is a planet that has like blue grass with a sort of greenish sky and the water is kind of orange, right? And there's creatures here that are also procedurally generated, but they're all quadrupeds. And there's one that floats around like a jellyfish, right? All of that ends up being procedurally generated. So even if you go to another planet that has all of those exact same things, it still might be slightly different, or more likely it'll be like, oh, this time the grass is red and the sky is blue, right? Sometimes that happens. And like I said, the more parameters you throw in and the more different, I don't know what you would say, the more different strings that you can pull on, the more varied and interesting that can get. But of course, you will eventually, if you put in enough time, you'll start to see similarities and all of that and everything. This, in some ways, right, if you're unfamiliar with procedural generation, it could sound a lot like current day AI, at least the colloquialism for like generative AI. But rest assured, it is very different from like AI or an LLM. Especially in the fact that like those tend to draw information for like generating whatever asset from a bunch of pre-created stuff, so much so that like, you know, they've gotten into big disputes around copyright, wherein they take assets and sort of like scan that in and try to generate something sourced from other bodies of work that have a copyright about them. There's definitely a bit of a blurring line, but make no mistake, procedural generation has been around for a long time. Like I said, in the case of the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall. Along those same lines as well, procedural generation does exist technically in contemporary Elder Scrolls games, right? And I think, you know, in contemporary Bethesda Game Studios games as well, I think it's easy to point out and show that procedural generation in some ways exists for Starfield. But the way in which it exists in Starfield exists in the same way that it does or maybe not exactly the same, but in a very similar way that it does, for instance, in Skyrim. So for Skyrim, what they did, they're on record having said this. I forget where, if it was like in a text-only interview or in like one of the documentaries or whatever that they've done, like part of No Clip. They did a series of Oblivion documentaries and all of that. But the way in which it works in something like Skyrim is, maybe it was about Fallout 4. But regardless, what they would do is they would have like a rough idea of the landscape that they would want, right? They would be like, we know we kind of want a river here. We want to like this to be a coastline. This should be like a big mountainous region. This biome should be roughly here. But what they would do is they would procedurally generate the specifics of the terrain, right? Like where exactly a hill would be and where it would slope. And then from there, they would go down with a more of a fine-tooth comb. And, you know, the procedural generation would create like the loose idea of like a putty, you know? And then you would have people who are like your level designers, people who sit down a bunch of clutter and all of that. Various designers would have at it and fill it with assets and shape the terrain physically in spots where, you know, oh, this cliffside should have a trail, right? I want a bridge to go over the river in this exact spot. We're going to dot the landscape with various dungeons, cave interiors here and there. And we want them to be roughly spread out in a certain amount. That way, if the player roams in most any direction, this I remember being in a Fallout 4 interview, wherein they made sure in Fallout 4, if you're exploring the open world, at any given point, they didn't want it to take too long for the player just to decide, well, fuck everything. I'm going to go like wander in a random direction. They want it to be like, at a certain point, after a certain amount of time, you should see a location pop up on your radar that invites you to explore it. You know, even if you just screw off the beaten path, you're like going off-roading big time. At a certain point, something should crop up and invite you to like adventure, you know, and there should be something interesting in there. That is the way in which there's the most procedural generation. You could also get into more fine-tuned stuff. Like technically, I think all of their games past, was it Morrowind or Oblivion? At whatever point they started using Speed Tree. Speed Tree is technically procedurally generated assets for trees in these games, right? But that's, I think, when we refer to the landscape in that way, and the trees as well, I do think that that's kind of getting around the point of the question, like the spirit of the question, wherein most people, when they say procedurally generated terrain or levels or anything like that, they're talking about like it's done on the fly, very much in the way that it works in No Man's Sky, in which you go to a planet and then that planet is generated procedurally. And the only way in which it's been pre-rendered out is if someone had already been there, you know? So for instance, in like Elder Scrolls, it could be like you go into a dungeon and the dungeon is randomized, and maybe it has the same name, but anytime a player goes into that dungeon, it would have like a similar framework. Like it's always going to be, for instance, like an old Imperial fortress. But upon re-entry, for example, if you're watching someone like me play through the game and you were playing it alongside me, you could go into that dungeon, and if it were procedurally generated, you might find like there's different twists and turns. Maybe there's even different enemies. Maybe a good way of putting it as well is that in a sense you could reasonably say that the loot is procedurally generated, right? In Skyrim, for instance, if you go into Bleak Falls Barrow and you start looking through treasure chests, you're liable to find different things because it not only scales with your level, but also there's a general amount of randomized loot. I think you could make an argument that that is procedurally generated by all technical aspects. But like I said, I think it gets around the spirit of the question being asked. I more so think that like the spirit of the question is, dungeons and terrain, like either open world level design or interior level design. Like I said, dungeons. I couldn't imagine it being like a city, but that would be a very wild take for a specific city to be procedurally generated. And as for my own thoughts on it being present in the Elder Scrolls, I don't think it would be very good, right? I think a great case against it is Daggerfall, is some of the ways in which Starfield kind of falls apart. There are a lot of the procedural generation in either of those games, whether it be set out ahead of time or it's performed in like chunks, how it is in Starfield. Like once you get on a planet in Starfield and you go far enough beyond the regular play area, you'll start to see like, oh, there's like repeating chunks of land. You know, those are not the same every single time you land on that planet. Like if you had 2 different installs of the game, if you land in the middle of nowhere on a planet and you start going out far enough, you're going to see some amount of variation. Like, oh, maybe there's a pond here, maybe there's a hill here, right? That's more so what I think people are referring to. And I think, like I said, those are some of the weaker parts of those games, because so much of these experiences are, so much of the experience that is meaningful to people is exploration, is the feeling of like living in another world. And although they're single player, I do think that there's a lot of sharing that world with other people, right? Especially in this day and age where there's no shortage of other people who play these games. You know, back in the day when folks were playing like even Morrowind, you were a little weird if you said, oh, were you playing the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind Game of the Year edition with the Tribunal expansion, you know? But this day, you say, oh, have you played Skyrim? Yeah, I did. Oh, I just went to Labyrinthian. There's a decent chance that the other person will know what you're talking about, right? On some level. Even if they haven't played Skyrim, they'll at least have an idea of like what it is. There is that sort of water cooler moment wherein you're talking with colleagues or classmates or whatever, just your friends in general. If you've both played the same game, it also functions on another level of people doing like videos or video streams, people talking about in podcasts. There is that sort of connective tissue where you do kind of like the idea of it being similar between people, but not too similar, because you still want to have emerging gameplay, which I think is the crux of it, in that is the way it should be handled. Which is to say, sort of how they've mostly been trying to handle it, you know, especially within the purview of Elder Scrolls games. And it is worth pointing out that as well, in recent interviews, I think it was with Kind of Funny with Greg Miller, Todd Howard himself, creative director, went and said that they do want to kind of go back very much to their sort of classic formula when it comes to Elder Scrolls 6 and whatever their next Fallout game will be. They do want to get back to this sort of similar formula, and it will play very similar to, you know, the sort of game that they have made forever, right? Which, having said that, you know, Fallout 76 and Starfield do play kind of similar, but there's no denying that the multiplayer factor makes a big difference, and the way in which all of the planets are set up and the density to which they are filled is certainly a point, right? Certainly a pressure point, if you will. I think a good way to see what they're sort of thinking of going back to is the Shattered Space expansion for Starfield, because they sort of like condensed almost all of the work from that DLC into one space, into one planet, one area on that planet. And you sort of get an idea of like, this is kind of what they're going for. And you see there's actually like decent amounts of verticality, cool landmarks, you know, sort of the stuff that you come to know from, if you appreciate the open world of Fallout 76, or of course, if you'd played Fallout 4 or Skyrim, all the hits, right? I think that's what they're going for. And I think that's the ways in which it can work if you have sort of this handcrafted framework, you know, but maybe procedural generation, proc gen, can serve as like a putty that a designer would form in such a way, like we talked about how they do with terrain. You could have that, so you could maybe have a procedurally generated dungeon, and someone goes in, they're like, I want to change around these parts because, of course, they use like a modular dungeon design system wherein you can sort of see like where they piece them together, they connect them together in different ways. I think in Skyrim, it's the most obvious with like the Nordic burial ruins. But oh my gosh, in Oblivion, it could not be more obvious the way in which the dungeons are modular, right? I think Oblivion is the most obvious they've ever been. But in Skyrim, they tend to do a pretty good job of hiding it and throwing in, you know, like custom set pieces for a dungeon every now and again to throw you off. But, you know, every so often you see like the vast majority of, you know, the dragon claw doors are like the same modular piece. So they'll clutter them up differently and throw like some pillars or like a bunch of dead bodies or something in the corner. And that also helps to feel it different. But I think that's sort of, like I said, the crux of the idea behind how to best wield proc gen in these games to make them satisfying to people. You can use it to make everything feel varied. Though I do think, crucially, it is important to lock in the proc gen and not have it procedurally generate the dungeon on the fly. Rather, you do that on the back end where the developers are like doing their work, like I said, forming the clay into a finished product, as it were, turning the putty into something enjoyable. On that end of things, I think that's the best way to do it, right? At least in their case, in their situation. Because that sort of meshes the most with what a lot of people already enjoy and come to their games for. At least speaking as myself, speaking for myself, I think that is that's what you would want, right? I think that's the way to go with it. You don't want it to be like you go inside of a dungeon and it's different every time, or it's different between playthroughs, or it's different between players. It's the same dungeon, but beforehand, before it got published or put into the game, put on the disc, put on like whatever amount of data into the .exe, it was procedurally generated then, and then that procedural generation was looked at and was given detailing by designers, and then that gets put in the game. You know, I think that's the way to go about it. And that's probably the best way to wield it, which isn't to say there shouldn't be any like custom, fully bespoke dungeons or interiors or anything. Like obviously cities, I think, are a big instance of where, you know, a city, if you think about it, it's like a dungeon, right? A city or village, it's like a dungeon, especially in Skyrim, where the vast majority of major cities you have to go through a loading screen to reach. But they're always the same, and they're very bespoke. There's very few reused assets between cities. They sort of have their own soul, if you will. And I think that's the way to go, right? I think there you can have stuff like that all over. You can even apply that to dungeons, especially when it comes to like big tentpole dungeons, you know, like your first dungeon that most players are liable to go into. I think that's totally fine and A-okay to have a whole bunch of like custom bespoke stuff. Right? Especially anything in like a mainline path. So obviously, I think there's decent and reasonable amounts of expectation for like the main story quest has a lot of custom and bespoke stuff, and the main story quest or the main major quest arcs. So like, you know, your Fighters Guild, your Mages Guild, or whatever equivalent they would be, they would have that treatment, maybe to a lesser degree, and then side quests would be like another notch down, and the miscellaneous stuff and all that, you know? I do think there is room for interesting situations with proc gen and Radiant quests. You know, if they wanted to go back to the well on Radiant quests, I think there is room for that, right? I think you could do something really interesting with Radiant quests if you wanted to keep them around. You could have them be like some sort of post-game situation in which, sure, Radiant quests as we know them today, right, that we're getting purely into like speculation here, or like wish making. We're being wishful here. I think a cool way in which you could handle Radiant quests is like have them as you're going through the game, have them exist as they do today, as they exist in like Fallout 4 and Skyrim, where you get a quest and it's like, oh, you go back to this area, and at the end there's like a big treasure chest that is refilled with loot. All of the enemies have repopulated. The levels of the enemies have rescaled to be somewhat appropriate to your character. You get all sorts of stuff like that, right? Good reason to revisit familiar locations. What if after you beat the game, there is almost akin to like a map system in like a Diablo or Path of Exile game, you know, wherein you sort of, and you can very easily make this happen through like Dwemer ruins or the use of an Elder Scroll, because there's so much time-space manipulation in Elder Scrolls. But you could have it to where like, oh, you socket in something into this device that wields an Elder Scroll in such a way, and it creates a dungeon for you to go through, and you get a little MacGuffin at the end. And maybe this time it's like a burial place. Thus, you know, it's very likely to have like between 2 to 3 different types of enemies, right? It could be like undead. Maybe there's bandits in there. Maybe there's like a combination of them, whatever. And you could have it to where the entire burial situation, the entire dungeon, is procedurally generated, and at the end of it, you know, you get like legendary loot or something. You make another roll for chasing the loot game if you so wanted. You maybe get materials for crafting, or building like a settlement or a ship or whatever it may be. I think there is room for that, and I think that could work because it's opt-in. You're opting into that, so you can completely ignore it. Similar, not too dissimilar from how the settlement system worked in Fallout 4, which there's only, 2 points of time in the main story quest where messing with the settlement system is even required. And even then, it's super duper, like, unimportant. I think having the player opt in and know, like, okay, I'm going into Radiant quests. Because already, if the player is, like, starting to fiddle around with Radiant quests, they're kind of, like, at the end game. They've done all of the, like, bespoke material. They've already seen most, if not all, of the dungeons. Have it to where that kind of unlocks at the end, and it sends you into familiar areas, just sort of, like, spun around differently, you know? I think there's room for that. I do think it's crucial, like I said, to have the opt-in, right? You want the player to know what they're getting into, and that will sort of filter out people who are like, oh, I just want the bespoke experiences only. And people are like, well, I've seen all the bespoke stuff. I want something a little freaky, right? I'm down for, I want to put more hours into this game, into this specific save file. Thus, let's mix it up a little bit, you know? And I do think that there is some room for that, especially given how they handled New Game Plus with Starfield. I think it's very fascinating that they have this ability to do New Game Plus with Starfield. I don't know if they'll do New Game Plus with like Fallout 4 or Fallout 5 or Elder Scrolls 6. But you could totally spin off that to like a lesser degree. You could totally have that work, I think, in such a way that it works in, like I said, a Path of Exile or a Diablo game, wherein you get different maps or whatever that you put into like an enormous device, and it opens up a few dungeons, and you can pick one to go through, and it has different parameters to pull on, and you can increase the difficulty and stuff like that. I think that could be fun. I think there's opportunity there to mess around with it. It's just, like I said, it's very important to make sure it's opt-in. Because it's such a wild sort of way of going about playing the game. It's only there for people who are like, you know, putting in loads of time into these games, who really are like the diehard lovers of these things, who, you know, a new one comes out, BGS puts out a new game, and you're liable to be like, yeah, I'm probably going to like it. On some level, I'm probably going to like it. I know that, they have like a lot of people, the the public perception of these games can wane and wax, but I know within my heart I pretty much always tend to like them, right? And I do think that the bespoke nature of it is very, very crucial to it. And I think you could also include some of the bespoke stuff with the proc gen. It would just be very difficult. It would be such an interesting technical feat, and it totally sounds like something that they would attempt to do, given like their experiences with trying to make like Radiant quests, Radiant AI when it came to Oblivion, all this sort of stuff. I think that 100% fits their like modus operandi to eventually experiment with it. If it's not Elder Scrolls 6, I think it would be very fascinating. And if anything, I'm surprised. I assume it's like limited on a tech level, but I am surprised that they don't do that with Fallout 76, because they have like the daily operations in Fallout 76, and those sort of random, you go through like some specific locations, specific dungeons that are designed for these daily ops, and they populate them with differently like randomly generated enemies. Like, oh, this time it's super mutants who have really high melee damage and will try to rush you, you know? Or this time it's raiders who have weapons that always bleed, you know? They always apply bleed damage to you. Or these are raiders to where like when you kill them, they explode and can deal damage to you and other raiders and stuff like that. They do have stuff like that in 76. And like I said, I think that they will totally try to experiment around with that in some form. I would love to see it applied on like a dungeon level. But like I said, it needs to be very much opt-in, and the core experience of like everything being bespoke should not be hampered by its existence. Otherwise, folks will be up in arms. I think in that sense, it needs to be like a post-game system. You know, you opt into it after you finish the main quest or after you've done some sort of like weird bonus side situation, you know? Anyway, yeah, that was pretty thought-provoking. Yeah, that'll do it for that question. That'll do it for this video as well. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, please take care of each other.